Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Ashley Studholm with the Prince William Conservation Alliance, and we are working to protect our valuable natural resources here in Prince William. You can check out our website at PW Conserve. Well, that's Google. The bar is getting in the way. Here we go. Okay. At pwconserve.org, where we have updates on important topics that are happening here in the county. And you can also go to our calendar to see our upcoming programs. We have several things in the works right now. Two things to mention is we're in the process of finalizing a few upcoming programs, which include 2 first day hikes on January 1st. And we'll have one first day hike at Manassas Battlefield. And it'll be an opportunity to enjoy the historic vistas and an important wildlife habitat that is currently being threatened by some troubling development proposals. And another first day hike on the Occoquan Greenway Trail, and that'll provide an opportunity for participants to explore a planned route that's part of the Occoquan Greenway. And details and links will be available soon right here on our website. And we offer these programs free of charge with support of people like you. And if you enjoy what we do here, I would encourage you to click join us, and you can donate safely on our website.
And also perhaps mention the match.
Yes, and through January 30th, we have a generous donor that will be matching all donations. And so it'll effectively double any donations that you wish to give, which we are very grateful for. So now let's get back to the primary reason why we're here. We're joined tonight by Valerie Huelsman, who will be discussing a new invasive insect that may already be in your backyard, the spotted lanternfly. Valerie is an environmental analyst for the Prince William County Mosquito and Forest Pest Management Branch, and we are lucky to have her here with us tonight. During the presentation, we'll have well, it's a small group, so we can kind of play it by ear, but in general, we'll just have everybody on mute, and after the presentation is complete, we'll open it up for Q&A and general discussion. Valerie, thank you so much for putting this together and joining us today, and take it away.
Thank you, Ashley. It's great to be with you all tonight. And yes, since we are a small group, if you all have any questions as we go along, please feel free to jump up and let me know. I will attempt to share this again. Everyone can see it okay? Excellent. Okay, so I'll get going. Ashley introduced me. So we will be talking about spotted lanternfly tonight. I'll give you guys a little bit of an intro and what you can do as a homeowner to provide some management opportunities. So we will also cover a little bit about the backgrounds, biology, management, and what you can do to help. Spotted lanternfly is generally abbreviated as SLF. So if you see that throughout the presentation, that is what that is referring to. And we'll start with a little bit of background. So SLF is generally considered to be native to China, India, Vietnam, Taiwan. It was also introduced to South Korea, and that kind of gave an early indication of what it would be like in making its way over to the US. It went across South Korea relatively quickly, and it also had a pretty significant impact on their wineries as well. Let me move one little window over here. Okay, that is better. And so it is a heavy phloem feeder. It excretes liquid honeydew as it feeds. That can be very apparent when you are going under some of these areas where it is heavily feeding. You kind of get a free spotted lanternfly shower, so to speak. So it can be a little bit disturbing, but it can also give you a good indication of when you do have a large amount of spotted lanternfly in an area. In the US, it was first found in Pennsylvania in 2014, later found in Winchester, Virginia in 2018. So that was the second location in the US that it was found. So a little bit of background about the damage. Spotted lanternfly is generally considered to be a plant stressor. The long-term impacts on forested areas are currently being studied, but it does seem to be a secondary stressor where trees that are already experiencing some degree of not in the best of health are going to be more adversely impacted by this invasive insect. The potential to transmit pathogens is currently unknown. There are some related plant hoppers that can transmit things like bacterial leaf scorch. Right now, we do not know if that's going to be the case with spotted lanternfly. Agricultural areas, particularly grapevines and hops, may require more intensive management as this pest shows up. It has been shown to kill grapevines. And also it just inhibits the growth and development of grapes through the season, as spotted lanternfly has a very high tendency to feed very heavily on these plants. One additional problem as well is the development of sooty mold, and this is an issue for staining materials underneath the areas where it feeds, and also understory vegetation as well. So if you have young plants, say bluebells, other plants kind of growing up underneath these trees, they can be stained and have their photosynthesis disrupted as part of the feeding process. And there is a possible concern as well for the bug adverse. So if you were not a big fan of the cicadas that kind of came through the northern regions of Prince William County this year, you likely will not be a big fan of these guys. They may grow on you a little bit, but they are very large insects. They do reach the point of pretty high populations where people in parts of Pennsylvania, Manhattan, do have to scoop them up, vacuum them up to get them out of the way, even in walking areas. Thankfully, they do not tend to invade houses as much as, say, stink bugs do, so that's one kind of silver lining. So status in Prince William County, they were confirmed here in the early spring of 2021. So far, we have one major area of establishment with a population in the thousands near the Broad Run of VRE, with a few smaller populations that have popped up in the Haymarket, Gainesville area. This population is kind of near to each other. In Nokesville, Dumfries and Woodbridge have had a very group of small clusters of spotted lanternfly pop up. So all these are continuing to be investigated. So many partners are working together to combat the spotted lanternfly. The Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services is really leading the effort, along with a couple other agencies. Local partners, we have the Virginia Cooperative Extension, Prince William Unit, the Prince William County Master Gardeners, and the Virginia Master Naturalist Merrimack Farm Chapter. We are still looking for new areas of introduction within the county, so you'll hear me say this many times throughout the presentation, but please do report any findings that you're seeing. That goes a long way to helping us identify new populations, which can then be controlled before they continue to spread out and establish further. So the Prince William County Mosquito and Forest Pest Management Branch, we're currently focusing on surveillance, outreach, and support. So now we're going to cover a little bit about biology. The scientific name for spotted lanternfly is Lycorma delicatula. It is a plant hopper in order Hemiptera, family Fulguridae. And the family is named after Fulgura, which is the Greek goddess of lightning. This was something that one of the Penn State researchers brought up. So they were, in the past, when they were first being investigated, thought to be bioluminescent. So while it'd be kind of cool, that is not the case. They do develop through incomplete metamorphosis. They are excellent jumpers, both as nymphs and adults, but poor flyers, but they can kind of weakly flutter and glide around. They feed by piercing through plant tissues to slurp up sap, both the nymphs and adults. They cannot bite, nor are they considered to be any sort of public health concern. They do tend to be very mobile when you run into them, so they can jump on top of you and definitely startle you, and their legs are a little bit on the irritating side, but they won't actually pierce your skin or anything like that. They're often found sheltering at the base of plants during the day or after falling, but will proceed back up the tree to feed, especially at night. They do tend to be gregarious, so they'll kind of clump up and feed and go up and down the tree together. They're relatively easily disturbed. If you have a kind of junky cell phone camera like I do and you like getting in really close to take a look at them, especially the nymphs, they will kind of dart around to the other side. So it's a very similar behavior to other leafhoppers that you can find in our area. So just kind of an interesting feature that they have, that they are a little bit camera shy and do tend to try to avoid things that they might think to be as predators. So life cycle, they do have one generation per year with some overlap. They will spend the winter as eggs. The adults do die at the first hard frost, significant frost, which we've already had. There might be a few adults still hanging around, but for the most part, the majority of spotted lanternfly has likely died for the winter. The nymphs will emerge in early spring, somewhere around 100 to 200 growing degree days, depending on which research you look at. This past year, they emerged in the beginning of April, so it was a little earlier than anticipated. So depending on how warm our winter is, we can expect them to pop up a little bit sooner. They do go through 4 nymph instars or stages, and they develop into adults by midsummer. So eggs are laid after a few months of heavy feeding in early to late fall. And each female lays about 2 to 3 eggs, consisting of 30 to 50 eggs per mass. So this is from the Virginia Cooperative Extension, just showing you a little bit more in detail about that life cycle. So you can see what a prolonged time frame that the eggs are visible. And so that is a great time to take a look to see if you might have any egg masses around. At that point, they're not moving around. The eggs are a bit cryptic, as we will continue to look at later, but if you look closely, you can definitely use this time period to do some visual surveillance for these egg masses. The first 3 instars or stages of the nymphs are black with white spots. As you can see right here, the 4th instar stage is red. One of my coworkers refers to this as the skittle stage, which is a pretty apt description. So they're very colorful, visible. They really stand out against the vegetation. So it's a good life stage to try to spot. As adults, they do tend to blend in a little bit. They have kind of a grayish cast to their wings, so they do tend to blend into tree bark. So this is typically what you want to be looking for. So because insects are cool, a little bit about their morphology. They have a mouthpiece that kind of pierces into the tissue when they are in their 1st to 3rd stage. They actually cannot pierce into the bark. It's not until they get to that 4th instar in adult stage that they can pierce into the branches and bark of the tree. But the mouthpiece is kind of folded beneath them, called a labium, and they extend it outwards when they feed. They have really sticky pads at the bottom of their feet, that final tarsal segment called aureolum, and that allows them to walk up even slippery surfaces like plastic and glass. Their antennae are below the base of their eyes. So sometimes, especially if you're seeing them kind of in the shadows, this kind of reddish structure does kind of look like an eyeball, but it is actually the base of their antenna. And they have just a very small needle-like antenna that protrudes out from that base. You can tell adult females from adult males by the presence of these organs called valvifers at the bottom of their abdomen. And this helps them to lay their eggs. Females in general are a little bit bigger than the males as well. So a little bit different morphologies there. So egg masses, again, they do tend to blend in quite readily into their surroundings, especially when they're laid onto trees. So you can see these 2 very small trees in the foreground here. And even though they're tiny, the egg mass pretty much is taking up that entire surface of the tree. You can see both of these right in here. One nice feature of the egg masses that helps to distinguish them from lichens that may be growing on the tree or just general disturbances to the bark is that they're very putty-like. So if you press your finger up against the egg mass, you'll actually leave an imprint of your finger behind. So if you look closely, you can see kind of the ridges left here as I was testing out these egg masses. So females do tend to aggregate egg masses together as well. And they're generally not really picky about egg mass locations. They will use trees that they are unlikely to feed on, like pines. And of course, any materials that are around trees too are fair game. Egg masses can take on a lot of different forms. They can be fully covered, partially covered, or completely uncovered. This is a good example here of a partially covered egg mass. You can see the jelly bean shapes kind of protruding out of the putty-like surface. Earlier, when they were first found, they were thought to only lay their eggs on very flat surfaces. And so that isn't always the case. Even they can cover things like this, this vine here, which, if I remember correctly, it was a, the words are escaping me tonight. They'll come to me eventually. So on the spine here against the bark, and also even here on this juniper bark that's a little bit more shaggy, it was able to lay their egg mass here as well. If the eggs are exposed for a while, that putty-like covering can actually be washed off. So all these egg masses here used to be covered. You can see kind of the remnant still lingering, but they've pretty much been well exposed, and you can really see the rows of egg masses quite visible. And there's roughly about 30 to 50 eggs per each mass. After they have hatched out, you can see the exit holes that they leave behind, and that can help you to distinguish old masses versus new masses when you're looking in the field. So you can see with how easily they can lay their eggs on almost any surface what the potential for spread actually is. So it's a very easy life stage to overlook, since they can be laid on pretty much any surface, including pallets, things like propane tanks, vehicles. All of these surfaces are susceptible to having eggs laid on them. So there's a big risk for potential for movement. Adults and nymphs can also be transported as well. And they can even crawl up underneath the hoods of cars and be transported that way. We have anecdotal evidence about this. And they can even disperse several miles on their own. They have a tendency to find vertical surfaces and proceed up them and then launch themselves into the wind to find new stands of trees. And they can actually go up to several miles launching themselves that way. So they can definitely spread on their own without any human intervention as well. They do have a tendency to pop up in unexpected locations far from known infestations too. An interesting occurrence happened with a 4-H fair insect display in Kansas. So this was an isolated confirmation that a young man included in just a general insect bug box, and that was 850 miles away from any known population. Thankfully, the judges knew what they were looking for, so they were able to do some investigative work around that area. And as you'll see in the maps in the next couple slides, they thankfully must not have found anything, or else they caught it just in time, but it's not included on any current maps. So that was just an unusual occurrence that really aptly shows how this insect can be spread vast distances. They've even found them on flights in airports in California as well, which of course, due to their wine industry, they really don't want it to show up there. So looking back in time to December 2018, Cornell University has been doing a great job of updating these maps to let us all know what the spotted lanternfly activity is looking like. So this was pretty early on, just 4 years after it was first discovered in the US. Berks County in Pennsylvania was the county where it was first found. So it's relatively isolated around that area. You can see that first pop up here around Winchester. And these yellow counties here are areas where just a few isolated spotted lanternfly have been found. So fast forward to December 2021, you can see what the spread is looking like. You know, a good chunk of Pennsylvania now has seen spotted lanternfly activity. You can see the continued spread in Virginia. A lot of these counties were actually added this year, including Prince William. There are some counties were able to maintain a small population or else completely get rid of that population that was initially found. So if we go backwards, you can see some of these counties in New York. Connecticut never had this population take off and start to establish. For establishment that's generally thought to be having a developing breeding population that continues to spread. If you just find 1 or 2 isolated occurrences of spotted lanternfly, they will consider that to not be an established population. So there have been isolated finds throughout kind of the Northeast region, but right now we have 11 states with active established populations. So it is definitely a difficult insect to control the spread of. So quarantines are enacted to help to decrease this risk of spread from infested to non-infested areas. So the movement of any life stage is prohibited. So as of 12/9/2021, we are not under quarantine in Prince William. So right now it's just these counties and cities here. The quarantine is enacted by the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And right now the quarantines are enacted by each individual state. They decide what counties that they do want to include within that quarantine. For businesses that need to move materials out of quarantine areas, they do need to apply and get a permit issued in order to move their products out of that quarantined area. and they do generally accept other states' permits that have been issued as well. So what do spotted lanternfly feed on? Short answer, a lot of things. So over 100 plant species worldwide are preferred by nymphs and adults. These are a few of its favorite things here. We have maples, grape, black walnut, oriental bittersweet, and sumac. Black walnut and oriental bittersweet, researchers have found that spotted lanternfly are actually able to develop exclusively on these species, which is pretty impressive. And grapevines, of course, are a favorite food and are highly preferred by them as well. At the top of its wish list, however, is Tree of Heaven, Ailanthus altissima, commonly referred to as Ailanthus. So this is kind of a quintessential invasive species. For those of you that are familiar with invasive plant species management, this is one that you already have some knowledge of, most likely. It is able to survive in very small amounts of soil. So you can see it growing even in things like stormwater catch basins along the sides of buildings. It is a very resilient species. It tends to continue to invade new areas through its roots. It produces a lot of seeds and it's spread by birds, other organisms, wind. It's just a very competitive species. It does really like a fragmented habitat. So you'll also find it frequently on the edge of forest. It likes a lot of sun, so it is usually excluded from the inner canopy of forests. It is pretty distinct as a tree species. It has very large leaf scars. The bark can be a little bit variable. Usually it's relatively smooth. Some people call it cantaloupe looking. It has very large compound leaves, and the seeds are also very distinct. They tend to last over the winter and have kind of a papery appearance after they've been on there for a while. These trees also, unfortunately, tend to grow along our transportation networks. So that's another higher risk. As spotted lanternfly are transported around areas, they can find these trees, which helps them to be able to establish. So another useful identification feature, they have a very unique odor. Most people would call it a very disagreeable odor. So this is good for confirmation if you're ever unsure of ID. If you scratch the bark just a little bit, usually you can get a nice whiff of it. And also just during hot days, you can kind of just smell it in the air. So once you smell it a few times, it's a very hard odor to forget. It was initially considered to be necessary for spotted lanternfly development. So now we know that it's very helpful, and it does increase their overall ability to do well, but it's not a required species. Spotted lanternfly is still highly attracted to Ailanthus, and they are very frequently found nearby. As you go looking for spotted lanternfly, Ailanthus is a great place to start looking. It's thought to provide compounds that make SLF less tasty to some organisms, which can cause them to avoid going after them or can lead to them regurgitating them back up. Some research has suggested that removing Tree of Heaven can help animals, such as birds, to just in general be able to digest spotted lanternfly. So early detection, this is really a focus that all programs really hone in on. The earlier that you can find these invasive species, the better that you can respond. Usually these two are tied together, early detection and rapid response, shortened to EDRR. And there's multiple ways that you can use to detect these invasive organisms. Oftentimes, citizen science is a great way to get information. Now with all of our citizen science apps, such as iNaturalist, Madden, all of these are great ways to report if you think you have found something, including the Virginia Cooperative Extension. You can also track for both nymphs and adults that we will talk about a little bit more. Visual surveillance can be highly useful. This is a large insect. It's about an inch or so as adults. So it is something that is relatively visible. Visual surveillance for tree symptoms can also be useful. So there's 3 types of traps that are commonly used. And usually you would place these onto Ailanthus. Sometimes researchers use black walnut as well. There is a joint citizen science trapping initiative from the Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia Tech, that our branch also participates in. We're always looking for more partners along with the Virginia Department of Agriculture that can work with us where we can put these traps up. So please get into contact with us if you do have Tree of Heaven on your property. So looking at these traps a little bit more in detail, when spotted lanternfly first showed up, sticky band traps were often recommended. Unfortunately, they do come with some bycatch, so they're not really the best trap to use. Even if you put kind of a mesh or netting over top of them, this can prevent birds like nuthatches and others that tend to hop along the trees to prevent them from accessing these bands. But unfortunately, other organisms like snakes, five-line skinks can still make their way up and unfortunately get caught to the bands. The bug barrier band over here to the right kind of alleviated that. The sticky part is actually on the inside of this band, but unfortunately you can still get organisms such as snakes kind of making their way up here and getting stuck to the opposite side of the band. The best way to reduce bycatch is using the circle band modified pecan weevil trap. This is attached directly to the tree. The mesh kind of siphons the insects up through here, and then they make their way into the bag. If you check these regularly, anything else that does get caught in the bag, you can release. You can put insecticide strips in there to kill any spotted lanternfly when you're dealing with high numbers. That can be very useful, but if you're dealing with kind of a low early detection numbers, you can just smush them or freeze them if you do end up with spotted lanternfly in the bags. And all these traps take advantage of this compulsion that spotted lanternfly have to move up vertical surfaces. And you will want to put these traps up on trees that are about 9 inches diameter at around 4.5 feet, and you install the trap at about 3 to 4 feet. So tree symptoms can also be useful to see if spotted lanternfly have been feeding in an area. Dripping sap you tend to find on Ailanthus anyway. They're pretty thin-barked tree species, so any wounds or any other insect that may be feeding on them can lead to dripping sap. With that honeydew excretion, you will see more ants and wasps in the area around the trunk than normal. Branch flagging is also a symptom, but that tends to be a very generic symptom. So even if you have some compacted soil, root damage, other health issues, that can still lead to flagging. So it's not necessarily the best one that will lead you to finding a spotted lanternfly population. Sooty mold is probably your best symptom to look for. And again, that is fungus that's growing on the honeydew that's excreted out as the spotted lanternfly are feeding. So now that we know what to look for, I wanted to talk a little bit about integrated pest management. So integrated pest management is essentially a strategy to ensure proper and long-term management of pests to reduce environmental impacts, costs, and ensure effective control. So this kind of outlines the general basic procedure of an integrated pest management program at kind of a very low homeowner level. So for this example, I'm going to be using one of my cats here. I thought about saying this was an example that I borrowed from a friend, but I figure it'll be easier just to admit to my mistake in this situation. So first you want to identify the organism. In this instance, my cat went outside, visited with a neighboring stray cat, and managed to pick up some fleas. So we were able to accurately identify that fleas were the pest. I think that most people would admit that fleas are indeed an insect that is a pest. So now that we have a proper identification, we want to take a look at the threshold. Now, what the threshold does is it determines when we want to actually start to take action to avoid any adverse health or economic impacts. So there might be some instances where fleas may be okay for maybe outdoor animals. You might be able to tolerate some degree of fleas. I think most pet owners that keep their cats inside, as I do not want to find any fleas on their animals. So in this case, the threshold would be 0. If we see any sign of a flea, we want to take action to get rid of it. So at this point, we would look at cultural controls whenever possible before we start looking at pesticides. So because my cat does stay inside, that usually excludes him from running into fleas. So usually that's enough where he would not come into contact with them. So by avoiding other hosts, he would be safe. In this instance, since he went out and talked with the neighboring cat, he was exposed, and therefore that exclusionary principle is no longer in effect. Mechanical control also falls under cultural control as well. Just like spotted lanternflies are hard to catch, so are fleas, probably even harder. So that's not really going to be a viable option in this situation. So our next step is to take a look at what pesticides may be effective. When we start looking at pesticides, you want to make sure you follow all label directions and take steps to protect non-target organisms and also consider environmental impacts. So flea collars, we tried to begin with, but then we figured that that's kind of making an undue risk to the cat that they could get caught on something hypothetically. So we moved on to gel treatment. That seemed to be relatively effective, and we were able to get that flea population down. One thing I neglected to tell you, this process of course happened while we were moving. So once we excluded the host from the area that we had been staying from our apartments, we took our cats to our new house. Returning back to the apartment a week later, there were fleas everywhere. They had no source of food. They were hopping all over the floor. As a seasoned pesticide applicator, I can tell you I was even a little bit disturbed. So I had to then move on to a more broad spectrum pesticide that took care of them, just so the next owner would not be too irritated at me as they moved into the house. So that kind of showcases how you move on to a more target specific pesticide going into a more broad spectrum pesticide as needed. And so after you do make these pesticide applications, you want to consider your approach. Even if you do only use cultural controls, it's still important to weigh how effective that these management activities actually are. Continue to monitor and adjust your approach as needed. So in this case, our cats continue to stay inside. So they are still not exposed to fleas. We continue to monitor with flea clones and make sure that they have no other undue visitors. So that's just kind of gives you a breakdown of what a very small scale integrated pest management program can look like. So challenges with spotted lanternfly and integrated pest management. So it is a relatively new pest. There's always a bit of a learning curve to kind of establish these best management practices and protocols. There, as of right now, is not an established threshold for management action. It's really on a case-by-case basis. There's an extremely high potential, as you've seen, for continued spread. They can feed on many host species, and there are many pre-existing stresses to trees in our region. Lures and deterrents are being tested, but there's none that are really marketed to try to manage this insect. There's some lures that apply towards many insects, such as methyl salicate, that are sometimes used, but more research is really being done to test their efficacy. We are also still working to understand population dynamics. One thing that they're seeing in Pennsylvania is after having years with high populations, the population can drop down to almost nothing. But researchers at Penn State do warn people to be on guard that that population can still bump back up again. So research is really still ongoing at this point. So management. There are some predators that can take advantage of spotted lanternfly. So anecdotally, there are many that do target spotted lanternfly, including spiders in this example up here. There are a lot of citizen science projects, research projects using iNaturalist. Also, birds biting bad bugs is one that's being run by a researcher. They've determined about 50% of all predators are birds, 30% arthropods. A couple of the birds that have been making headway against spotted lanternfly: chickens, cardinals, blue jays, catbirds, tufted titmouse, so all interesting. And research is in progress with the USDA and other partners to evaluate biocontrol options as well, such as parasitoid wasps and fungi such as Bavaria bassiana. So there are some preemptive management steps that you can take to reduce SLF spread. So again, having some of these exclusionary principles in place. If you avoid parking near Atlantis where possible, keep your windows rolled up. That's one less route that they have to make their way into new places. Continue to report any findings. I'll repeat this a few more times. It's still very important for Prince William County and also our neighboring jurisdictions, Stafford County, Fairfax County, that have not yet found spotted lanternfly. So reporting will definitely do your part in order to get that early control going. Remove, manage Atlantis. This is a long-term process, but just because it does help them to perform a little bit better and kind of increases their potential for development, this can help overall to manage them. So one tactic that people advocate for is to remove 90% of all Atlantis trees and leave 10% of male trees behind and then treat these trees. So as spotted lanternfly preferentially go to Atlantis, they are killed by feeding on Atlantis. So that's the trap tree method that can help to reduce the overall population in the area. If you do have trees on your property and you know you have spotted lanternfly, chipping wood can help to reduce egg mass viability. Buying firewood locally using labeled heat treated firewood is another approach as well. Grapes, hops, fruit tree cultivators should work closely with groups such as BCE and the Soil and Water Conservation District to prepare. There's a lot of great guidance specifically for people that do grow grapes, so I highly encourage you to check that out. So let's say you do have spotted lanternfly. What should you do now? So we'll go over a few steps. Step 1, verify ID as needed. If this is your first time noticing it in your yard or community, please do report. We do recommend right now to go ahead and smush nymphs and adults. You don't need to save them for identification. Sending in a picture is great, and we do prefer that, but you do not need to save them for any additional form of ID. You can also double bag and submerge egg masses in rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer as well. There are multiple reporting options. We're working to streamline this process a little bit, but right now you can report any findings through Virginia Cooperative Extension, BDAX, and also through us at Prince William County. Step 2, assess your trees and plants. Are they actually susceptible to spotted lanternfly? Look at what species you have. So young nymphs, we talked about all the multitude of plant species that spotted lanternfly will feed on. That host range is a lot broader when the nymphs are younger. They'll feed on garden plants such as basil, cucumber, roses, but as they get older, that host list narrows down. So things like red maples, things like black walnut, ailanthus, they start really narrowing their focus to their preferred host plants. So do take a look at what you have in your yard and what might be a target for them. The nymphs, when they do tend to feed on all these other garden type plants, they are consuming less sap and they will move on quickly. So they're only going to be feeding for a week or two, and then they'll start to move on and target their preferred host plants as they grow older. How healthy are your trees? So this, sometimes spotted lanternfly is compared to emerald ash borer, and it's not necessarily a fair comparison, besides they're both invasive insects that are spreading rapidly. Emerald ash borer does kill ash trees, while spotted lanternfly really is a tree stressor. So if you keep your trees in better shape, you will be able to avoid a lot of the damage that spotted lanternfly can cause. So work with professional certified arborists, government representatives, volunteers to assess your trees and see what you can do to improve their health. Are you also close to high-risk areas for SLF? So are you around some of these transportation corridors or some of these industrial areas where you may be a little bit more likely to see spread? You might want to take a few more steps to make sure that you are monitoring and that you do have a plan in place. So step 3, you've been kind of taking a look at your yard, thinking about what you need to do. And so you found spotted lanternfly. So you have a few options. Option 1, you don't necessarily have to take any action. Say you went ahead and you reported, you're continuing to monitor, you're checking any materials that you're moving out of your yard. You don't necessarily need to do anything else. We do recommend option 2, cultural mechanical control. If you can remove some by smushing them, I've seen some people, one of our volunteers with the Master Naturalist kind of gently shepherds them into a bottle. That's one way to kind of remove them, dump some hand sanitizer on them, and you can kill them that way as well. That's one option. Again, with a low population, you can help to reduce the general population in the area. You can also work with local groups to install traps on your property for surveillance, and that will also help to reduce the overall population as well. Organic and biological control, this can be a longer process. So it's a little bit better served by local governments and state and federal agencies, but especially on the organic insecticide route, that is definitely something that homeowners can use. Systemic, I apologize, that should say systemic and contact insecticides. There are several options available. Do recommend working with a Virginia State certified pesticide commercial applicator and for trees with a certified professional arborist. So to go over a few of these options to manage spotted lanternfly, First, a few notes about systemic and contact control options. So contact insecticides do kill on contact, as they're either sprayed over the insect, or if the insect either hops or crawls onto the pesticide, it will kill them as they come into contact with it. While on the other hand, systemic insecticides are incorporated into the plant. So as the target insect feeds, they are killed. So as spotted lanternfly would feed on the phloem sac within the tree, that's when they get that dosage that would kill them. And systemic insecticides do typically continue to provide control for a longer period of time. Timing is also very important. Of course, like we've mentioned, you always want to follow the label exactly. Flowering plants are a risk for pollinators. You want to make sure that you are not applying pesticide while plants are flowering. For something like Tree of Heaven, they have flowers that are highly sought after by pollinators. So timing that systemic insecticide to after the tree has already bloomed is a good way to make sure that you are avoiding this pollinator issues. So dinotefuran and bifenthrin are both pesticides that are typically recommended by agencies and researchers. Both dinotefuran is a systemic pesticide, while bifenthrin works by contact. So all of these have some degree of toxicity. Many of these are toxic to bees. So again, taking careful consideration to apply them during periods where bees are not active on your target plant is very vitally important. You also want to consider the application method. Trunk injections are injecting the pesticide directly into the tree, and this reduces that risk of non-target effects. So that can be a good way to do this, but you do want to work with a certified applicator. Many of these recommendations too are taken from the Pennsylvania State Management Guide, which I thought I had a link here. There it is. So in case you want to read up on this in more detail, which I highly encourage, definitely check this out. There are some organic options available as well, neem oil and natural pyrethrins. These are both OMRI rated to apply in organic agriculture. But note that they also still have high toxicity to fish and bees with neem oil and for fish with natural pyrethrins. So again, just because they are rated for use in organic agriculture, you still want to proceed with caution and make sure that you follow all label directions. Biocontrol, like I mentioned, is still in the process of being researched, but hopefully in the near future, it will be more recommended. The Bavaria bassiana fungus is commercially available, but it's still being tested for efficacy. So spotted lanternfly action summary. Step 1, keep your trees and plants healthy. Monitor for any issues that may affect health and mitigate. Step 2, do continue to report any findings of SLF. If possible, smush adults and nymphs, destroy egg masses. Make sure you stay up to date on status and follow all quarantines. Small populations can be managed through traps, mechanical control. Ailanthus management can also help. Evaluate conditions to determine if chemical control is needed, follow all label directions, and protect non-targets. So thank you all very much for listening. Hopefully this makes it a little bit clearer. There's a lot going on with spotted lanternfly. There's a lot to look for. So you can always get into contact with us here. This is our contact information for the branch. I did put together some resources for you all as well about a few things that were referenced during the presentation. Thank you very much to the Prince William Conservation Alliance, Kim and Ashley, for hosting us tonight. I'm glad to take any questions if you all had any.
This is great. Thanks so much, Valerie. And I'll include the resources that you're providing here in the follow-up email. And yeah, this is a fascinating talk. I learned a ton. And I have a couple of questions, so I'm sure other folks might have questions too. So I will open it up for.
Well, wait a second. Can you stop sharing your screen so we can all see each other then? There, look, I'm with people.
So does anyone have any questions for Valerie?
I had one.
Eileen, go ahead.
In the beginning slide, and I'm not sure, they were very different in color. Can can you talk about that?
The adults were very different in color, or
Mhm.
there is some difference. Sometimes when the light catches them just right, there is more of a pinkish hue to their wings. So the color can vary a little bit. That very first slide, they looked very dark. So kind of the head was facing you. So it does look very different when it's looking at you face on versus to when you're looking at kind of the dorsal back view. So there is definitely a difference that way, but you could see kind of the antennae sticking out of the head, that kind of pink bulbous like eye looking sort of view. So yeah, definitely depending on what viewpoint you're looking at them, that color can vary. But yeah, the wings typically you'll see the wings folded together and they'll be grayish to gray pink generally when you see them live in the field.
Oh, thank you.
I have a couple of questions.
Go ahead, John.
And I'd like to thank Prince William County because I own the bee store. It's called the bee store. And Prince William County always comes in and gives me coloring books and information about spraying and all this, and I really appreciate it. But recently they gave me a bunch of stickers about the spotted lanternfly. And so I want to know a couple of things. Number one, what does the spotted lanternfly do to the trees? Like, I don't, like, what is the concern? That's the question I get. Number two, is it a social insect or is it solitary like butterflies or mason bees and so forth? Then what should I tell customers if they see this spotted lanternfly? Who should I tell them to call, or what should I tell them to do? And finally, what is a good option? Because I looked at that list of all the things that are bad for bees, but what's a good option for treatment of their gardens and so forth? And so there's 4 questions there, and I'll leave you to it.
Thank you very much. I'll do my best to try to answer them. If I miss anything, please let me know. As far as the damage that they do to trees, so they're phloem feeders, they feed on the sap, so that weakens the tree over time as that isn't available for its normal processes. So particularly for a tree, say that's growing in a normal urban environment with compacted soils where it's already in kind of a suboptimal environment, that's going to be something that can further weaken it. Or we talked a little bit about black walnut, where it's already under stress from things like thousand cankers disease. That's again another inciting factor that may go ahead and weaken it further. So that's kind of the damage that you can see. For grapevines, it has been found to completely kill vines as well as reduce the viability of the fruit. So just not having those sugars available to the rest of the plant. Younger plants that are growing underneath trees too are impacted by that sooty mold developing on the honeydew that's excreted from spotted lanternfly. So that can impact young trees and also trees and plants in the understory. As far as being a social insect, yes, they do tend to kind of group together, and you can commonly see them on the trunks of trees feeding together. And like I mentioned, they do tend to lay their eggs in clusters as well. As far as pesticide options go, kind of what I was getting at with the integrated pest management is you don't necessarily have to move into the pesticides. Really, you only want to do that if you're seeing a high population, you have a tree that you are concerned about in terms of health. You do not need to take a step just because you're seeing a couple spotted lanternflies in your yard to go ahead and move into applying pesticides. You want to look at this on a case-by-case basis, and of course, work very much to protect our local pollinators and native bees as well. And as far as who to report to, right now there's multiple groups. We're trying to streamline this a little bit. So there's one reporting mechanism across both us and Virginia Cooperative Extension. Virginia Department of Agriculture kind of has their own reporting measures in place. But generally you can call us directly, or you can also go to our website at pwcba.gov/about.es. That should be included on that resource page. And you can set up a site visit with us, or just go ahead and even email us a picture and location of where you found a spotted lanternfly. So if I missed anything, please let me know, but thank you very much for the questions.
No, thank you very much, because like we've been gifted with these awesome coloring books from the county and some a bunch of picture stickers that say like identify the spotted lanternfly. And then we want to tell people like, okay, if you see this, what do you do? And so I guess the best thing is just to say, contact the Prince William Conservation Alliance, or like, what is the best thing to say to the people?
I think for the time being, go ahead and tell them to contact our branch directly. And what we can do too is drop off a flyer for you if you'd like. If you'd like to post it in the store, we have a QR code that they can scan, and that report would be emailed directly into us should they see anything. So that's what we recommend is an easy way for them to go ahead and make that report in.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great.
Sure.
That way we could say like, okay, here's a invasive species, and here's what you do if you see it.
Yeah, we'd be glad
Perfect.
to do that.
Perfect. Okay, thank you.
That's
Great
great. Thanks,
presentation,
John.
by the way.
Thank you.
And that's really helpful too. And I'll be sure to include the contact information, because that's a really key point in kind of the management plan of the spotted lanternfly is early detection, and it's relying on all of our eyeballs to track that down. So that's an important part of that. Carol, come on in.
Yes, the first question is on the tree of heaven. So let's say we have a lot of tree of heaven, and when the spotted fly comes, which presumably eventually it will, does the spotted lanternfly, in addition to killing nice things like walnut trees, will it also affect the tree of heaven, or is that just so robust in the way it grows that it doesn't help get rid of it?
That's a great question, Carol. So tree of heaven is one of the tree species that has been shown to be really adversely affected by feeding, just because they target it so heavily. So they have seen tree mortality in tree of heaven due to spotted lanternfly feeding. They haven't seen that in a lot of other species. Usually it's younger sapling trees, particularly with black walnut. They have seen younger sapling trees die, but for tree of heaven, yes, they have seen it die off. You know, if it didn't affect everything else, it would be a great biological control, you know, for tree of heaven, but sadly it does affect these other species. So yeah, it can help to decrease their vigor a little bit.
Okay, that's the first question. Now the second question is, we're trying to start here to get rid of the tree of heaven, and we're running an experiment. We're a very small experiment, but the person in charge of landscaping is for free, actually, because they want to do some experiments themselves to see what works. He's a Virginia Tech graduate, and I guess he's gotten interested in this issue. But I think we're going to go after like one tree and hopefully get a tree that has spread out, and by putting a little pesticide on the tree that's cut down, hopefully that spreads through its the trees, the other trees that it's produced. I don't know, the other clones. So is that a good way to do it? I mean, it's an experiment from our point of view, but does that look like a reasonable experiment to try?
Definitely. That's a great question. Yeah, management for Ailanthus tree of heaven is really intense. It really takes a couple of years, and it's always something of an experiment, because each site is a little different. The good news is there are a lot of best management practices in place. One of the resources that I included on that list is a guide from the Virginia Department of Forestry to manage tree of heaven. So that goes into detail what steps you should take in order to kill tree of heaven. So you do need to go ahead and apply herbicides usually to be able to kill it, because otherwise you will just continue to get those clones and suckers coming up out of the root system. So once they have what they call a hack and squirt method, where you do cut into the tree and then you apply a herbicide such as triclopyr to those cuts, and that's able to manage it. But there are other herbicides available. So it's kind of depending on the situation. If there's water nearby, definitely look carefully at that list and see what
Oh yeah, there's water nearby.
Okay.
Okay, well, I mean, you know, the guy is a landscaper. He's more interested in, I mean, his background is landscape, not killing tree of heaven, but he's really working on it. But you know, he's learning.
And the
So-
Virginia Cooperative Extension is another great resource. If you have specific questions on invasive plant management, they can definitely give you some help in that department as well. Sometimes they can have a master gardener come out, and or one of the cooperative extension agents can come out and help you guys through that process too.
Oh, that's good to know. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Carol. It's really fascinating, the connection between an invasive plant species and this invasive insect species, and how managing one helps manage the other. And I also love the technical terms of smush for the lanternfly and hack and squirt for the Helianthus. Any other questions? I had a quick kind of practical question. I'm unfamiliar with what a quarantine really looks like. You said that there are areas that have quarantine initiated. What does that look like at a practical level? Is it just about like moving plants across borders, or what does that entail?
It's a good question. It's really dependent on the pest of concern. For spotted lanternfly, each business that is taking material and moving it out has a checklist where they self-certify that they're taking the proper steps to inspect their equipment, inspect their product that's being exported out of that quarantine area. So it's a lot of additional work on the businesses to meet the quarantine. They also have to make sure that people go through the training as well to get that permit. On a homeowner level, you also cannot move items outside that contain, you know, those active life stages, but they have more of a checklist system for you. So you can kind of check off that, yes, I checked under the car, I'm checking any lawn furniture I have outside, my grill, to make sure that I'm not introducing something from my yard to someone else's yard. So, I mean, it's a lot of time, and it's a lot of keeping up to date on the best procedures to take to reduce that potential of spread.
Okay, thanks. Last call for questions. This has been a really great Q&A part too, and thank you, Valerie, for taking the time to go over everything, and your great explanation for integrated pest management, which was also quite wonderful. And I think we're wrapping up here, unless anyone unmutes and wants to jump in. All right. Well, with that, we will call it a program. Thanks so much, Valerie. This was really great, and I know that everyone really got a lot out of this presentation, and there's a lot of resources that folks will find useful, and hopefully folks here and abroad will keep our eyes peeled and report anything that we find and help get this under control.